In the humid dawn haze over central Vietnam, the jungle seemed to breathe. Mist clung to the treetops, drifting in slow, opalescent sheets as if the land itself were exhaling after another violent night. For most men on the ground, that first light offered temporary relief, a fragile sliver of peace between firefights. But for the crews of the United States Army's medical evacuation helicopters, known simply as Dustoff, it meant the beginning of another day spent racing fate. Dustoff pilots did not wait for war to find them. They flew directly into it. While infantry crouched behind cover and artillery fired from the safety of sandbagged positions, the helicopter crews obeyed a promise etched into every mission brief, every scratched flight log, every trembling radio request. When someone is bleeding, Dustoff goes. It didn't matter if the landing zone was cold or hot, secured or swarming with enemy fire, marked or invisible beneath thick jungle canopy. It didn't matter if the weather was punishing, or the radios unstable, or the enemy creeping unseen. Dustoff crews launched because someone out there was clinging to life, and seconds mattered more than fear. This story follows one helicopter, the UH-1H Iroquois, better known as the Huey, assigned to the 54th Medical Detachment during one of its most punishing operational days of 1969. It is not tied to the memory of one man alone, for Dustoff missions rarely belonged to a single hero. They were collective acts of defiance against death, performed by pilots, medics, and crew chiefs who carried the wounded with the same tenderness a parent might give a child. They flew not only soldiers, but Montagnard fighters, South Vietnamese villagers, stranded Marines, downed pilots, and at times even enemy wounded. Dustoff was the one call where politics and uniforms did not matter. If you were bleeding, they came. On this particular morning, the Huey sat on the PSP metal landing pad outside LZ Nancy, its olive-drab fuselage glistening with condensation. The red cross on its nose, bold and unmistakable, was both a shield and a target. Officially, it marked the aircraft as a non-combatant, protected under the Geneva Conventions. Unofficially, the Viet Cong in North Vietnamese Army often saw it as a high-value prize, an aircraft whose destruction would shatter American morale and deny life-saving support. The crew had gathered before first light. The pilot was Warrant Officer Bill Hartman, a calm and steady flyer in his mid-20s, whose quiet demeanor belied the sheer number of missions he had flown. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Michael Casey McLean, was younger, only months into his tour, and still wearing the raw, earnest alertness of a man who hadn't yet grown numb to the radio crackling with casualty reports. The medic, Specialist Richard Hale, had the gaunt look common among men who had seen too much blood, too often, yet still found a way to speak gently to the wounded. And the crew chief, Sergeant Paul Wexler, carried himself with the grave pride of a man responsible not just for the helicopter, but for the lives that depended on it. As the morning sun slowly rose over the ridgelines, the crew performed their routine checks. Wexler moved with quiet precision around the Huey, inspecting rotor blades, checking oil levels, feeling the tension on the tail rotor chain. Hale prepared bandages, saline, plasma, morphine, and the green canvas litters that would cradle the wounded. Hartman and McLean reviewed their maps of the mountainous region east of Quang Tri, a place where the jungle swallowed entire companies and the enemy slipped like smoke across the trails. At 07:17 hours, the radio erupted. Dustoff, 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 this is Ghost Rider 2-1. We have 3 urgent wounded. Repeat, 3 urgent. Taking fire. Request immediate evac. Coordinates. The crew had rehearsed this moment thousands of times, but no amount of preparation dulled the shockwave of adrenaline that hit their bodies. Hartman scribbled the coordinates, McLean switched frequencies, Wexler sealed the side doors, Hale secured every piece of gear he could. Within 30 seconds, the Huey's engine roared to life, the turbines winding up to a scream that penetrated the jungle stillness. The rotor blades blurred overhead, kicking up dust and foliage in a spiraling vortex. As the Huey lifted, its skids leaving the metal pad behind, the men who remained on the ground watched with a mixture of awe and concern, because once a Dustoff left the safety of the base, there was no guarantee it would return unscarred. The terrain ahead was unforgiving. Mountains rose abruptly from the jungle floor, their slopes choked with bamboo and towering dipterocarp trees. The sky was deceptively clear, a thin blue veil that masked the presence of enemy forces dug into concealed bunkers. Every ridgeline, every ravine, every hidden valley had the potential to erupt in automatic fire. As the Huey gained altitude, Hartman's voice crackled through the intercom. "We'll come in low. Trees will give us cover. McLean, keep your eyes on that left ridge. Wexler, open those doors and get ready. Hale, prepare for multiple litters." The co-pilot scanned the horizon. "Copy that. Ghost Rider 2-1 reports heavy contact." Hearing those words settled heavily on everyone in the cabin. Heavy contact meant chaos, fragmentation grenades, hidden machine guns, and enemy marksmen waiting for any helicopter silhouette to appear over the treetops. The flight took only minutes, but time stretched in a peculiar way for Dustoff crews. Every second brought them closer to danger, and closer to the wounded. The radio transmitted muffled gunshots and frantic shouts from the platoon on the ground. Someone yelled for more ammo, someone else screamed a name followed by the metallic clatter of a rifle hitting earth. Then Hartman saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from a clearing barely large enough to fit the helicopter. The smoldering patch of elephant grass had been burned intentionally by the infantry, a desperate attempt to signal their location while under fire. The LZ was far from ideal. Dense jungle pressed in from all sides, and the slope of the ground tilted dangerously. But there was no hesitation. "Going in," Hartman said simply. The Huey descended with a trembling precision. Tree branches whipped around the nose, scraping the skids as the aircraft hovered inches above the ground. Bullets snapped past the cabin, cracked against tree bark, and hissed overhead in angry arcs. Wexler braced himself at the open door, gripping the mounted M60 machine gun but refusing to fire. Dustoff Hueys were forbidden to carry offensive weapons. They relied on speed, maneuvering, and luck. The infantrymen sprinted from the tree line carrying 2 wounded soldiers. Hale leapt out, moving low, staying within the helicopter's downwash as he guided them toward the cabin. He worked with a strange combination of urgency and calm, a medic's paradox, checking their pulses, assessing shrapnel wounds, cutting away fabric slick with blood. Then a third soldier lay still at the edge of the clearing. The moment Hale's eyes locked onto him, he broke into a run. The enemy fire intensified. AK-47 rounds tore through the grass, biting into the dirt. The Huey's engine whined as Hartman fought to keep the aircraft stable in the unpredictable crosswinds swirling through the narrow landing zone. Hale slid beside the fallen soldier and dragged him backwards with a burst of strength fueled not by muscle, but a medic's stubborn sense of duty. When he reached the helicopter, Wexler helped lift the soldier onto the deck. "Go, go, go," Hale shouted, pounding the metal floor. Hartman pulled the Huey upward, tilting its nose to gain speed. The helicopter surged into the air, gliding just above the treetops. At their altitude, even small arms fire could end the mission. But gradually, the gunfire thinned. The jungle swallowed the noise. The clearing vanished behind them. Inside the aircraft, Hale worked furiously. One soldier had a sucking chest wound. Hale applied a foil-sealed occlusive dressing and secured a saline line. Another was losing blood from a mangled leg. Hale applied a tourniquet, tightening it until the bleeding slowed. The third soldier showed no signs of breathing. Hale pressed a resuscitation mask over his face and began rhythmic compressions. McLean looked back from the cockpit, watching as Hale fought for life inside a vibrating aluminum tube flying through enemy airspace. The contrast was stark, the calm, controlled environment of the cockpit and the chaos unfolding in the cabin. "Just hang on," Hale murmured to the unresponsive soldier. "Not today, not on my aircraft." The Huey reached the field hospital 15 minutes later, a sprawling compound of tents, steel hooches, and dusty walkways buzzing with medical teams. As soon as the Huey touched down, a swarm of orderlies rushed forward with wheeled stretchers. Hale relayed vital signs, injury descriptions, and treatment notes with the rapid clarity of a man who had done this too many times. Then, as the patients were transferred, a doctor approached Hale and gave him a solemn nod. "Those 2 have a fighting chance. The third, we'll do everything we can." Hale nodded, but the weight of the mission lingered in his expression. No matter how many he saved, the ones he couldn't always haunted him. The Huey lifted off again within minutes. Dustoff did not rest. Its engines barely cooled. As Hartman climbed into the sky, the radio crackled once more. Dustoff, Dustoff, Dustoff. This is Copperhead 6. We've got civilians hit by mortar fire. Urgent evac needed. Another mission. Another unknown. Another set of lives hanging in the balance. And the day had only just begun. For the Dustoff crews, heroism did not manifest in grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It lived in repetition. Launch after launch. Landing zone after landing zone. Wound after wound. Courage was measured not in the number of medals one earned, but in the willingness to fly again despite the scar.
The request for civilian casualties felt different every time. Soldiers were trained, equipped, prepared, at least as much as any human could be for war. But civilians carried none of that armor, neither physical nor emotional. They lived their days planting rice, tending water buffalo, cooking morning meals over clay hearths, and praying their children would reach adulthood in a land split by foreign boots and ancient resentments. When the call came in for villagers struck by mortar fire, the Dustoff crew felt the weight of it settle over them like a lead blanket. Hartman steered the Huey west, toward a cluster of hamlets that lined the river valleys. From above, the land looked deceptively peaceful, patches of flooded rice paddies reflecting the sky like shattered pieces of glass, bamboo huts arranged in uneven rows, narrow footpaths snaking across the terrain. But the closer the crew drew, the more they saw signs of chaos. Smoke rising from a thatched roof, figures running through the fields, the faint shimmer of panic carried on the morning air. As they approached, the radio transmissions grew frantic. A South Vietnamese militia member relayed the situation in broken English. A mistaken mortar strike, North Vietnamese artillery aiming for a nearby ARVN outpost, shells falling short, exploding among the huts. Entire families were wounded, some were barely clinging to life. Hale prepared his supplies with grim precision. He set aside IV bags, bandages, plastic airways, and tightly wrapped rolls of gauze. Wexler opened the doors wide, securing them with the metal struts as wind roared inside the cabin. McLean read the coordinates again, guiding Hartman toward a narrow strip of land just beyond the burning huts. As the Huey descended, smoke curled into the cabin, carrying the scent of charred bamboo and burning cloth. Villagers rushed forward, their faces streaked with soot and fear. Some waved their arms desperately. Others knelt beside the wounded, pressing cloths against injuries, whispering words of comfort in voices trembling with despair. Hale leapt from the helicopter the moment the skids touched down. A middle-aged woman lay on her side, blood pooling beneath her ribs from a jagged shard of shrapnel. Hale applied pressure, checked her breathing, and gently rolled her to assess the exit wound. She winced, but did not cry out. Shock was already taking hold. 3 more victims were carried toward the Huey. A boy no older than 10, his leg torn open, an elderly man limp and gasping, and a young girl whose small hands clutched a broken bamboo flute. Hale's mind entered a kind of medic's tunnel vision. Age, nationality, uniform, it all dissolved. There were only wounds and time. He guided the boy onto a litter. The leg wound was severe, but the bleeding could be controlled. He wrapped bandages, applied a tourniquet, checked the pulse in the child's foot. Then he turned to the elderly man. The shrapnel had torn through his chest cavity. His breaths were shallow. Hale inserted a needle between his ribs to release trapped air, a battlefield procedure meant to save minutes, sometimes only seconds, but minutes were everything. He moved to the girl last. She was barely conscious, eyes half open, her flute still grasped between her fingers. The blast had thrown her backward, slamming her against a clay water jar. Her spine might be injured. Hale immobilized her gently, careful not to worsen any unseen damage. Hartman's voice cut through the intercom. "We're taking sporadic fire from the tree line. We need to lift off soon." Hale shouted back, "1 minute!" Villagers screamed warnings as dust puffed in the dirt near the Huey, enemy rounds snapping into the ground. Hartman powered up the engine, the rotor wash flattening grass and scattering ash. Hale and Wexler worked like a single unit, loading the wounded inside while bullets cracked against the nearby huts. When they were finally airborne, the village shrank beneath them, the people left behind, waving with a mixture of relief and pleading desperation. Hale didn't allow himself to look back long. There was still so much work to do. Inside the cabin, he stabilized the girl first. He adjusted her airway, started an IV, and whispered softly, even though she was barely conscious. The elderly man's condition fluctuated with every breath. Hale monitored his vitals, adjusting his position to ease pressure on his punctured lung. The boy cried silently, biting his lip to keep from screaming, tears streaming down his face as Hale injected a measured dose of morphine. For a medic, silence was a complicated thing. It could mean calm. It could mean fear. It could mean death. But aboard at Dustoff, silence was simply another battlefield to navigate. The Huey pitched down at the nearest medical facility, a joint U.S. ARVN station staffed by nurses, surgeons, and interpreters. Hale transferred the casualties with swift precision. The girl's flute fell from her hand as the stretcher was lifted. Hale picked it up and placed it beside her on the gurney. The boy gripped Hale's sleeve before being wheeled away. Hale ruffled his hair gently, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As soon as the last patient was handed off, the crew boarded again. Dustoff missions were relentless. There was no celebration, no pause for relief. The lives saved were a quiet victory, overshadowed by the endless flow of new calls. Back in the air, the radio almost immediately crackled to life. Dustoff, Dustoff, this is Black Eagle 35. We have wounded Rangers engaged near the ridge. Hostile fire heavy. LZ unstable. We need you. McLean looked at Hartman. That's a hot zone. High elevation. Narrow landing. They say they're pinned down. Hartman didn't hesitate. Set a heading. Wexler instinctively tightened the strap on his helmet. Every time we go into those mountains, I swear the enemy has our number. Hale checked his blood-smeared gloves, wiped them on a rag, and started preparing fresh equipment. Doesn't matter, he said quietly. We're the only ones who can get them out. The ridge in question was known as Hill 312, a place where steep slopes, thick vegetation, and enemy fortifications created a natural fortress. The Rangers had moved in to disrupt an NVA supply route, only to encounter a network of concealed bunkers. The firefight had erupted without warning, a classic ambush. As the Huey approached the coordinates, the mountain rose before them like a dark monolith. Smoke drifted across its surface. Gunfire echoed in staccato bursts. The Rangers were entrenched halfway up the slope, taking cover behind fallen logs and shattered boulders. Dustoff inbound, Hartman radioed. Negative, a voice replied. You can't land here. Too much fire. Hartman keyed the mic again. We're coming anyway. Mark your position with smoke. A pause. Then, throwing purple, now. A plume of purple smoke blossomed from a clearing barely wider than the helicopter itself. Hartman exhaled slowly. All right, let's bring them home. The approach was treacherous. Enemy fire erupted from camouflaged positions above and below the landing zone. Bullets cracked against the Huey skids. Leaves and branches flew through the open doors. Wexler crouched low, shielding Hale as the medic braced himself to leap out the moment the helicopter touched down. Hartman brought the Huey in with surgical precision, the skids hovering only a few inches above uneven terrain. The moment they were stable enough, Hale bolted out. 3 Rangers lay behind a line of rocks, all badly wounded. One clutched his abdomen, his uniform soaked. Another had a compound fracture in his leg. The third, a lieutenant, was unconscious, blood matting his hair. Hale reached the lieutenant first, checking his airway, then the bleeding. The skull wound was severe. He stabilized it with gauze, secured the neck, and signaled for Wexler to help move him. A burst of machine gun fire raked the ground inches away. Dirt sprayed into Hale's face. He did not flinch.
The second ranger screamed in pain as Hale assessed the shattered bone. The medic splinted the leg quickly, then moved to the third patient. The abdominal wound worried him. Internal bleeding was likely. He applied pressure, sealed what he could, and lifted the soldier with the help of 2 rangers still able to walk, all while the firefight roared around them. When the last casualty was aboard, Hartman lifted the Huey sharply, tilting sideways as an NVA machine gun opened up from above. Bullets thumped into the fuselage, punching holes through the metal skin. Hale threw himself over the wounded, shielding them with his own body. Hartman swung the helicopter around the ridgeline, descending rapidly to break the enemy's line of sight. The rotor blades screamed as they cut through hot, turbulent air. Only when they were miles away did Hale finally allow himself to breathe fully. But even as he worked, stabilizing the lieutenant's vitals, he could see the strain in the pilot's shoulders, the tension in Wexler's jaw, the focus in McLean's eyes. They had taken damage, they had pushed their aircraft to its limits, and it wasn't even noon. Yet as the transmission ended for the Rangers, a new voice broke through the radio static. "Dustoff, Dustoff, any aircraft available. We have multiple wounded Marines near the river bend. Request urgent extraction." McLean looked at Hartman. No one spoke. They didn't have to. He turned the Huey toward the river. They were still the only hope.
The hours after midnight were always the most uncertain for Dustoff crews. The air changed. The war changed. The jungle seemed to rearrange itself, hiding threats where none had existed at sundown. For the men of the 236th Medical Detachment at Camp Evans, the night of March 14, 1968, became the kind of night that burned itself into memory, not through a single catastrophic event, but through a slow, relentless accumulation of danger, fatigue, and resolve. From the outside, a UH-1H Dustoff helicopter looked simple. A boxy fuselage, rotor blade shimmering in the dark, skid gear stained from a month of hard landings. But beneath that familiar silhouette was a system stretched to its breaking point. Pilots who hadn't slept more than 3 hours in 2 days, crew chiefs whose hands were raw from hasty repairs, and medics working on instinct and muscle memory because exhaustion had long since drowned out conscious thought. Shortly after 1 a.m., the radio came alive again with a voice trembling just enough to betray the urgency behind the request. A platoon of Marines west of Hill 558 had walked into an L-shaped ambush. They needed extraction, not at dawn, not in an hour, now. The narrator's distant voice cuts in. Every minute mattered. A wounded Marine lying on the jungle floor was in a race against blood loss, shock, infection, exposure, and the simple passage of time. Dustoff was often the only variable that could tilt the equation back toward survival. Inside the hooch, the pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Dale Harrison, pulled himself to his feet before he fully heard the coordinates. Men like him didn't run toward heroism, they ran toward necessity. "Cranker," he said simply, and the crew chief shoved open the door, sprinting into the heavy coastal air toward the helicopter. Rotor blades began turning before the crew was even fully aboard, vibrating the air with a familiar thumping that sounded like hope approaching to wounded men in the jungle. As they lifted off, the night pressed against the canopy like a living thing. No moon, no wind. Just miles of darkness broken only by distant flashes from artillery batteries firing illumination rounds. The Huey pushed forward, nose slightly down, skimming treetops, its presence concealed by the night but announced by its unmistakable sound, a sound both feared and prayed for. At 1:27 a.m., they reached the coordinate grid where the Marines were pinned. What they found was chaos, green and red tracers stitching through the dark, explosions from 60mm mortars lighting up the canopy, and the desperate flashes of signal strobes from wounded men trying to guide the helicopter down. The pilot descended into a swirl of dust and smoke.
the blades chopping the night air into shivering waves. The Huey shuddered as AK-47 rounds stitched across the tail boom, but the pilot did not climb out. He held the descent. The narrator's voice again. Dustoff crews accepted a truth most men never faced. Sometimes the only way to save lives was to fly directly into gunfire. The medic, Specialist Jim Nolan, jumped off the skid before the helicopter fully settled. He moved low, weaving through ferns and broken branches, guided by gasps, shouts, and the unmistakable wet rasp of chest wounds. He found 3 Marines clinging to consciousness, one slumped against a tree, another face down but alive, the third staring at the sky as if waiting for permission to stop fighting. He worked fast. Tourniquet, hemostatic dressing, field-expedient needle decompression. His mind wasn't thinking, it was performing, guided by a discipline that had been carved into him by months of combat. Bullets cracked through branches overhead. The leaves around him exploded in flecks of green. A Marine beside him whispered, "Doc, don't leave me." Nolan didn't. Back at the helicopter, the crew chief was waving, shouting over the rotor wash. 2 minutes. It wasn't a threat, it was reality. Every second the Huey stayed on the ground increased the chance it would never lift off again. Nolan dragged the first Marine toward the helicopter, boots stumbling through mud. Another Marine helped with the second. The third, barely breathing, was carried by 2 riflemen whose faces were streaked with sweat and grit. Then came the problem neither side expected. The enemy shifted positions, and suddenly rounds began slamming into the clearing from a new direction, hammering the Huey's aluminum skin, sparking off the rotor mast. The pilot yelled through the intercom, "We stay or we go! Call it!" Nolan didn't answer with words. He shoved the last Marine's stretcher onto the skid and climbed in after him. His silence was the answer. The pilot pulled collective, the helicopter lifting with a roar. Branches whipped past, shrapnel pinged off the fuselage, and for a moment the Huey hung suspended between disaster and escape. Then, it cleared the tree line. The Marines on the ground saw the helicopter rise and vanish into the night, whispering thanks into the blackness, because they knew, absolutely and without question, that they were alive because those men had come. Inside the chopper, Nolan's hands were already deep in bandages again. He didn't look up when a round tore a hole through the cabin wall inches above his shoulder. He simply held pressure on a chest wound and said, "Stay with me, Marine. Stay awake." The flight back to Camp Evans took 11 minutes. It felt like 11 years. When they landed, Nolan and the medics at the aid station offloaded the wounded with a precision that belied the chaos they'd just survived. Doctors leaned over the stretchers, barking orders. Plasma was hung. Morphine was delivered. Scalpel trays slammed open. 3 lives saved. The helicopter's crew didn't wait to hear more. The pilot walked around the fuselage with a flashlight, counting 19 new bullet holes. The crew chief was already patching 2 ruptured hydraulic lines with tape and clamps. The smell of burnt oil hung in the air. The narrator returns. In the Vietnam War, Dustoff helicopters averaged 1 bullet strike for every 18 missions. That night, Harrison's crew took 19 in a single hour and prepared to launch again. By 3:15 a.m., the helicopter was back on standby. By 3:22 a.m., the radio crackled again. And without hesitation, the crew returned to the aircraft, their faces hollowed by exhaustion but fueled by the unbroken understanding that as long as wounded men were out there, Dustoff would fly. The night was far from over. The worst, they would later say, was yet to come.
The mission that came just before sunrise became the one the crew remembered the most, not because of the danger, though it was extreme, and not because of the casualties, though there were many.
It was memorable because of what it revealed about the men who flew into danger again and again, night after night, without expecting glory, recognition, or even safety. Shortly after 5 a.m., as the sky began to lighten, a battalion of the 101st Airborne reported mass casualties from a sudden mortar attack near the Ashau Valley. The landing zone was already compromised. The enemy was still close. The wounded were bleeding out. Dustoff was launched into a dawn sky streaked with smoke. As they approached the valley, the helicopter descended into a wide bowl of jungle drenched in morning haze. The smell of burned cordite still clung to the air. The unit had taken hits to its command post, and medics on the ground were struggling to stabilize more than a dozen wounded soldiers. The Huey circled once to assess the situation, the pilot spotting smoke plumes, broken tree line, smoldering equipment, and a clearing so small it barely qualified as a landing zone.